Great War came as no surprise. Stirrings of war had been brewing for some time. As early as 1911, Major Herbert Musgrove of the Royal Flying Corps declared, "When it comes, it will come suddenly. We shall wake up one night and find ourselves at war. It will be the hardest, fiercest, and bloodiest struggle we have ever had to face." The giant war machines of Germany, Russia, France, and Great Britain mobilized in early August 1914. World War I had begun. Initiated as a ground war, it quickly became apparent that the course of the war was not progressing according to the military timetables. More accurate information was needed, specifically the enemy's strength and whereabouts. Aerial reconnaissance with dirigibles had already been attempted by both Germany and France. Unfortunately, their massive size and lack of speed made them ideal targets from the ground. Military specialists had been discussing the airplane's proper role for years. Liaison, bombing, combat, reconnaissance, all were considered. Scouting was elected. So it was that pilots went to war in the role of scouts, a band of airborne cavalry. Aerial troops of warring nations had one thing in common. They were better suited for training fields than the unexpected emergencies of wartime service. When it became apparent that scouting missions also required the ability to deny a position to the enemy, a new breed of aircraft was required, one that went beyond the use of pistols, rifles, and hand grenades. An editorial in the London Morning Post would foresee the future. It read, "The airplane is a wonderful instrument for reconnaissance. Most certainly it will, just as surely as the horseman, be challenged to fight for its information, and must be armed and equipped to accept the challenge." When French aviator Roland Garros mounted a machine gun on the cowling of a Morane-Saulnier Boulet and attached steel bullet deflectors to the back of her propeller blades, the world's first fighter plane was born. In April of 1915, Garros went down behind enemy lines. It wasn't long after Anthony Fokker inspected Garros' crude gun installation that the Germans, too, had forward-firing, line-of-sight guns on their airplanes. Later, Fokker eliminated the need for deflectors by developing an interrupter gear activated by an engine-driven cam to allow the gun to fire only between the blades. Fokker's Rhinebecker began appearing on the Western Front in the autumn of 1915. With its two forward-firing Spandau machine guns, it caught Allied pilots completely unawares. The Fokker Terror virtually drove the Allies from the skies. Supremacy of the air passed back and forth from nation to nation throughout the war. Each nation's new creation forcing advancement of the other nation's aircraft. Designers worked feverishly to create bigger engines, better lift, superior weaponry, higher speeds, maximum altitudes, and bomber capabilities. In the early years of the war, the Germans were most well equipped. Fokker Rhinebecker, Pfalz D3, and Albatross D3 were excellent fighters for their time. It was only when the French Spad arrived on the scene in the fall of 1916 that Germany was faced with a serious challenge. Designed by Louis Bechereau for Armand Depardussin, the Spad was powered by a water-cooled V8 Hispano-Suiza. The Hisso was remarkably advanced for its time, with overhead cams, a one-piece aluminum block, dual ignition, and forced lubrication. The aces loved the Spad. In its first 6 months of use, the French Stork Squadron shot down more than 200 enemy aircraft. To French ace Georges Guinemet, his Spad was his flying machine gun, carrying him to 54 victories. Guinemet even had one built with a huge 37mm Hotchkiss cannon. When Eddie Rickenbacker, America's ace of aces, first flew with Uncle Sam's hat in the ring 94th Aero Squadron, He was in one of the Nieuports cast off by the French. Rickenbacker praised the Spad, saying, "They were more impressive by far than any other airplane. This would mean the difference between life and death. The best ship I ever flew. The new Spad could do 130 miles an hour, climb to 22,000 feet, and stay together no matter what maneuvers you put it through." Rickenbacker returned to the United States having achieved 26 victories in his faithful Spad. In Great Britain, the Royal Aircraft Factory responded to the need for fast, maneuverable, tractor-engined fighters by producing the SE-5 series. The SE-5s would lead many a British ace to victory, including Albert Ball and James McCudden. Britain's top ace, Edward McMannock, achieved most of his 73 victories in an SE-5A. The SE-5A was one of the fastest World War I fighters, second only to the Camel. This is a full-scale replica of an SE-5A. World War I aircraft are a special interest of its owner and pilot, Javier Arango.
This is an RAF SE-5A. It's a late World War I British airplane, and together with a Sopwith Camel, it was the major British fighter of the war. The SE-5 was designed for stability and speed, and it had a big and very heavy engine as opposed to a small light engine that gave maneuverability in other planes like the Sopwith Camel. This is I think, a very romantic aircraft. It's a beautiful design. It has its weight distributed through the fuselage. It's wide and very comfortable, and it's, I think, one of the typical British fighters that was ever built. The see-through part of the airplane is inspection plates, and you can see some progress there. They were already thinking of airplanes that would survive more than 2 weeks, and you have to inspect parts of it. You can also see the shoelacing on the side. That's so you can re-rig the fuselage and repair bullet holes. So these airplanes were not designed to go out and get shot down the next day, maybe the next week, but it was progress. The first test pilot was probably very happy, very pleasantly surprised. It's a very stable, very easy airplane to fly. You can see by the very thin wing that this aircraft was designed for speed more than maneuverability. This is a very comfortable airplane to fly as far as the pilot is concerned. It's unusual in a First World War airplane to have a small cockpit where you can duck down and keep warm, keep out of the wind. You also have an excellent field of view. The wing is ahead of the pilot, and it leaves you all this room to look around, and that's very desirable in a fighter.
During the war, Sopwith was Britain's greatest manufacturer of fighter aircraft. The first of Sopwith's planes to make a resounding name for itself in the war was the Type 9700, nicknamed the 1.5 Strutter for its interplane strut arrangement. The 1.5 was the first British fighter designed with a synchronized gun, as well as the first to use the Russian-designed scarf ring rotating machine gun mount for rear cockpit gunners. The 9700 also helped pioneer both the variable incidence tail plane and dive brakes, both in use today. This replica of the 1.5 Strutter is the only flying example of its type. Here again is pilot Javier Arango.
This is a Sopwith 1.5 Strutter, and it's a British design. It got its name 1.5 struts because of the layout of the struts on the wing. This type of plane usually had 2 inner struts between the wings. This one has 1.5 strut.
While in appearance, the 1.5 Strutter resembles the SE-5A, it lacks some of the aerodynamic refinements of the 5A. The Strutter feels lighter in flight and offers less control in high winds. This difference in handling is one of the refinements learned over the course of the war. The Strutter being an example of an early wartime aircraft, and the SE-5A a later model.
There are several things that this airplane was the first, and it was the first Allied aircraft to have a synchronized machine gun and be able to fire through a propeller without hitting it. It was also, after the war, the first aircraft to operate from an aircraft carrier, to actually make the first landing and takeoff from the carrier. And it's also important because it was the first, one of the first in the line of the Sopwith fighters. From this aircraft emerged the Sopwith Pup, which is basically a single-seat reduced version of this aircraft. And from that one, the very famous Sopwith Camel. This is a very gentle airplane. It's a very gentle and very straightforward aircraft. Its aerodynamics are excellent. It has a long fuselage, which makes it very stable laterally. It has a lot of wing area, so it flies very slow. It's extremely predictable. It never surprises you. The only problem this aircraft can have is on a windy day. It's so light and has so much wing that any crosswind will pick up the wing and direct it sideways on the takeoff or landing rolls. But if there's no wind or you can land into the wind, it's one of the best flying airplanes I've seen.
The 1.5 Strutter went on to father the Sopwith Pup. The Pup became known as the pilot's airplane, easy to fly with excellent maneuverability. They became great rivals of the Albatross. It was a Pup that made the first landing of an aircraft on an aircraft carrier. But the most successful British fighter of the war was the Camel. With its larger rotary engine, the Camel had higher overall performance, but also produced higher torque. It was a humpbacked, stocky biplane with double ailerons. All of this added up to a highly maneuverable plane. As Charlie Myers, a U.S. instructor based in France, said, "It could turn so fast, it could bite its own tail." Pilots who were comfortable with the docile nature of the Pup or the stability of the 1.5 found the Camel to be dangerously different. Wing Commander Norman McMillan would say of her, "Here was a buzzing hornet, a wild thing, burning the air like raw spirit fires the throat." The Camel was the first British plane to carry twin Vickers guns that did not require constant reloading. Sopwith would reign supreme until 1918, when Fokker came up with the DR-1 triplane. The DR-1 counted among its pilots renowned ace Manfred von Richthofen, often referred to as the Red Baron. With its triple bank of wings, clean lines, and almost total absence of wires and struts, it gave the appearance of floating. But von Richthofen's description gave one a much different impression. He said of her, "It climbed like a monkey and maneuvered like the devil." The Fokker Triplane was the first fighting airplane to use a thick airfoil section, providing it with a gentle stall and excellent handling at slow speeds. Added to that was its spectacular climbing rate and superior ability to absorb a considerable amount of enemy fire. While the DR-1 was the plane that led von Richthofen to immortality, it was also the vehicle to carry him to his death. This DR-1 was built in 1980 by owner and stunt pilot Chuck Wentworth. In constructing this aircraft, he followed original plans for the DR-1. And although he knows his aircraft from the ground up, Mr. Wentworth finds it a challenge to fly.
This particular triplane, it's probably be described as the most demanding airplane. Something you must fly all the time. It requires you to be on the airplane continuously. Every takeoff and landing is very demanding. Many of them were crashed in accidents in takeoff and landings. If you hesitate in this particular airplane, you're going to be in real trouble. It is so blind, literally until you've come to a stop. You must fly the airplane until it's tied down. The first test pilot in the Fokker triplane, I'm sure he was very scared, and upon landing, if he didn't crash, I'm sure he got out and kissed the ground.
The end of World War I brought a resounding sense of relief to the world, but it left an unsettling feeling for many young pilots. Having experienced the thrill of combat flying, they could not easily return to an ordinary profession. Instead, many attempted to earn their living with their airplanes. Establishing a flying first was one occupation open to these pilots. The rewards for pilots who were willing to dare the unknown were lucrative, with prizes often in excess of $50,000. Sir Ross Smith made the first flight from England to Australia in a Vicker's Vimy. The Vimy's ruggedness, range, and ease of handling made it an ideal vehicle for distance flying. A Vimy would carry Captain Alcock and Lieutenant Brown from Newfoundland to Ireland in the first non-stop flight across the Atlantic. Not all record attempts were successful. On May 8, 1927, pilots Nungesser and Coley entered a contest sponsored by the London Daily Mail to cross the Atlantic. After their celebrated departure, they were never seen again. Lieutenants Nelson and Smith established another first when they flew around the world using two Douglas World Cruisers. Pilot and designer Geoffrey Dehavilland showed that it was possible to refuel in the air. Each of these events opened new avenues for aircraft. One new direction was passenger transport. To the dismay of the British, the French achieved the first international passenger flight using a Farman Goliath. Within just a few short years, the skies would be filled with passenger airlines from a variety of nations. Many countries discovered the convenience of using planes for mail service. Both England and the United States began airmail service in 1919. Mail delivery helped to foster other records. In 1923, using a modified Fokker T-2, Lieutenants Kelly and McCready flew 2,500 miles from New York to San Diego to establish the first non-stop coast-to-coast mail service in the United States. In only a few short years, transatlantic travel, passenger airlines, and aerial mail service became a reality. Commercial enterprise became the new driving force behind aviation. In the beginning, all a barnstormer had to do was fly from one cow pasture to another, giving people rides. But it didn't take long for the novelty to wear off. The crowds wanted bigger thrills, and thrills they got. Barnstormers became stunt flyers. They began with aerobatics, loops, barrel rolls, falling leaps, and spins. Rope ladders were hung off the sides of the planes for daring pickups. These stunts would become old hat. A new trick was needed. The flying circus hit the air. There were more planes, better stunts. Even trapeze artists and high wire performers joined in the act. Wing walkers became the rage. Stepping out on the wings, often without a parachute, they'd walk, dance, do headstands, if it pleased the crowd. The people always wanted something new, something more daring. Soon there were barnstormers leaping from plane to plane. Barnstormer Carl Dixon remembered those days as a sometimes terrifying experience. I pulled away a second too soon to keep from hitting the other aeroplane, and poor Bartlett was hanging in mid-air with only one hand on a strut of the other plane. Fortunately, he was a very muscular guy and could pull himself up. But when we got back on the ground, he chewed my tail off for almost dumping it. Soon there were no surprises. When the crowds thinned, barnstorming became a thing of the past. But it left a legacy of aviators. Walter Beach, Charles Lindbergh, Wiley Post, Roscoe Turner, and Clyde Cessna, to name a few. It was the Standard, along with the Curtiss Jenny, that carried many of these barnstormers to their glory. The Hall-Scott engine that powered the early Standard had two drawbacks. It lacked the speed required for many of the more difficult maneuvers, and it also had a tendency to catch fire in midair. The new Standard D-25 was designed specifically with barnstorming in mind. The Hudson River Valley in New York State is the home of the old Rhinebeck Aerodrome. It is here that Cole Palin, the founder of the Aerodrome, houses his authentic D-25.
Well, the barnstorming airplanes flew great. They had to fly great because they had to operate in and out of small fields. They had to be easy to fix, easy to fly, and carry hopefully four or more paying passengers. I had my first ride in one of these airplanes, and it cost 50 cents. Early on, they used the Jenny, and then they found that the old Standards would carry 4 passengers. But then when things really got organized, and the government got in the act and said, you got to license these airplanes, you got to license these pilots. Oh, that was terrible because there was nobody who had any license. Then the leading American barnstormer, Ivan Gates, who really had used the old Standard, that was his bread and butter, carrying 4 passengers, but he could no longer get a license. So he went to a gentleman by the name of Charles Day, who was a designer of airplanes, and he said, design me a new airplane. And Charles Day designed the D-25 Standard, his 25th airplane design, D for Day, and this is the new Standard, new in 1928. Back in the early 30s, when I was a kid, my hero then, well, he still is for that matter, but my hero then was Johnny Miller. And Johnny Miller was a barnstormer with this kind of an airplane. And he's told me what it was like. If there weren't many people around buying rides in this airplane, he'd give them a nice long flight over town, hoping to get more people out. But if the people were lined up, waiting for a ride, then It was a case where you had to have two people, one person to pull the passengers out, the other person to push the passengers in. As soon as the 4 passengers were in, he gave it the power, hats were flying, glasses were flying, he'd take off, he'd head right for the trees at the other end of the field, he'd pull up, wow, and do a big old wing over, and the people would be looking straight down at the earth, another wing over, straight down at the earth, cut the power, side slip in, and land, all in about 2 minutes. The people had a ride, they'd seen the heaven, they'd seen the earth, they were glad to get back on the ground. 4 more people then were pushed in. 4 people were pulled out, 4 people were pushed in. And that's the way it could be on a good day barnstorming.
A number of aviators put their flying skills to more practical purposes. They hired on to deliver the mail. Mail flights were a common thing in many nations, but for the United States, with its broad expanse of land, they became a necessity. The aerial mail service was established in the United States by a handful of young pilots and 100 surplus DH-4s turned over by the Army at the end of the war. Flying for the mail service required courage. In 1920 alone, 1 in 6 pilots were killed on the job. When Dean Smith joined the service in 1920, his friends questioned his sanity. Smith explained that in those days, the airmail service was considered pretty much a suicide club. But for those who survived, Smith added, it was so alive and rich a life that any other conceivable choice seemed dull. In keeping with the adage that neither rain, sleet, nor snow would keep the mail from its appointed destination, the service pilots took pride in overcoming all types of weather and malfunctioning instruments. The DH-4 compasses were notorious for straying up to 90 degrees from the proper heading. Pilots became adept at navigating by the tracks of the railroad lines. This was such a common practice that the tracks were soon called the Iron Compass. To avoid head-on collisions with oncoming air traffic, pilots always flew to the right of the tracks. The DH-4 became the first plane to regularly fly the mail at night, after being modified with landing lights and lengthened exhaust pipes to keep the glow of the exhaust from hampering the pilot's vision. The airplane was here to stay. As aircraft became more sophisticated, there were ever-increasing demands on the skills of the pilots. It became universally apparent that adequate flight training was a necessity. Shortly after the war, Britain used a variety of aircraft for their training programs: Avros, Bristols, Dehavillands, and Hawkers. But a new trainer came on the scene in Britain that would clearly separate the training approach of the British from that of other nations. Geoffrey de Havilland's Tiger Moth. The Tiger Moth had its flaws, but in the mind of the British, the fact that it was not the most perfect handling machine actually made it a better trainer. If a pilot was sloppy in technique, the Tiger Moth made it all the more apparent. Here, pilot Javier Arango spins the prop for Chuck Wentworth. Chuck is a veteran stunt pilot. Javier Arango recounts the evolution of the Tiger Moth.
The Moth trainer was considered by the British Air Force as a primary trainer for its pilots, and it was rejected as such because mostly of a small cockpit, especially for the pilot sitting in front. If you notice that the aircraft has little side doors on the fuselage that open and give the pilot more shoulder room and an easier way to get in and out. The Tiger Moth was built to fix that problem with a taller upper wing and easier access, especially for the pilot sitting in front. The Tiger Moth flies quite well as long as you stay within its limits. It's an underpowered aircraft, which is good for training, and it is an aircraft that has just enough controls to keep it under control in most situations. But it is not an aircraft in which you can afford large margins of error. In aerobatics, because the aircraft is slightly underpowered, you have to start the maneuver at the exact speed. If you start a little slow, you don't have the excess power to carry you through the maneuver. Again, a very desirable thing for a student, because then he really learns to do the things exactly the way we're supposed to. If he doesn't, he's out of control. And the same thing applies for landings. It's a very light airplane, and that means that any wind will have a big effect on the aircraft. Teaches a student to watch where the wind is coming and to be able to correct for a crosswind. It was a very versatile aircraft. As a trainer and as rudimentary transportation, very short field operations, so it went wherever the British Empire was.
In the United States, soldiers with a minimum of 2 years of college who passed a physical exam and motor skills test were accepted for flight training at Randolph Field in Texas. Randolph Field became known as the West Point of the air. The U.S. philosophy toward training was the exact opposite of the British concept. Rather than use a frail and light aircraft like the Tiger Moth, the American military employed big, sturdy planes. The Boeing-Steerman Cadet became their primary trainer. The Cadet was relatively easy to fly. Pilot Bud Davison said of the Steerman, "If you feel an overwhelming urge to crash an airplane, this is obviously the one to do it in, since the Cadet will poke a hole in anything you decide to hit." This is a late model Steerman, the PT-17. In the cockpit is pilot Javier Arango.
This is a radial engine. It has cylinders all around the crankshaft, which allows it to have a very short crankshaft, which, again, unlike the gypsy engines, allows for drastic changes in power without bending any components internally. The Steerman achieved fame as a trainer for the U.S. during World War II. The aircraft was built by Boeing, although the inventor was not working for Boeing, and it is characterized as an extremely strong aircraft. It has been modified since the war with engines anywhere from 220 horsepower to 600 horsepower with minimal changes to the airframe, and that testifies as to the structural integrity of the aircraft. It's overbuilt in every respect, which is a very American way of building aircraft. The American training program that started with the Steerman is very different from the British. It is not better or worse, but their philosophy in the U.S., and the Steerman is a typical airplane of that philosophy, is to have a very rigid system where the student learns by phases and goes from one aircraft to the other. The Steerman was designated a PT airplane, primary trainer. The Steerman will teach the pilot how to fly a open cockpit biplane, how to hear the wind over the wires, how to control a difficult aircraft to land, and how to use full controls to achieve the results he wants. the Steerman is an excellent flying airplane. If anything, the Steerman is a little like a horse that looks at the rider and notices that the rider knows exactly what it's doing. If he doesn't, then the Steerman will be very, very quick to let you know. On a landing especially, it has a terrible tendency to ground loop. But if the rider of the horse or the pilot of the airplane is sharp and knows the airplane well, then he can do whatever he wants with the Steerman.
I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and hit that notification icon for the latest videos as they are released. Thanks for watching and catch you in the next one. Ciao for now.